Hey, so you're going to want to stick around to the end of this one because Damon actually traveled to Santa Rosa, New Mexico, and interviewed a man who said he has personal knowledge that Billy the Kid wasn't killed by Pat Garrett because Billy the Kid was part of his family.
And did he have a tale to tell? He even had pictures of Billy with his family. And in the interview, he shares exactly what happened the so-called night where Billy was shot and killed.
It's an interview you don't want to miss.
Now, we know that this is not part of the paranormal, but it was on True Stories Only, and this is part of a throwback series for True Stories Only, and the story is fascinating.
It really is. On a more exciting note to me, Velarcana, our sister channel, is doing really well. So we're going to stop reporting here for just a bit in order to concentrate on the mysteries over there.
Yeah, Velarcana is different. It's more relaxed. We share all types of mysteries over there, including personal stories. Over the last couple of years, we've been doing this. Amy has been writing everything down that she comes across, and she's cataloged it all in this book. So eventually, we began to call it Amy's Book of Mysteries, and it's what we pull all of our reports from.
Well, and I'm excited because you guys know I am a big nerd, and I have written down so much. And it's not just paranormal either. It's anything really just unexplained.
Yeah, so we post over there every Thursday, 7 p.m. EDT.
And we'll be posting a report tonight after this one.
And now, Billy the Kid. Thoughts of the American Wild West brings up tales of adventure and images of powerful, ruthless gunslingers like Butch Cassidy, Jessy James, Wyatt Earp, and arguably one of the most famous gunslingers in all of American history, Billy the Kid. These men and others like them have been immortalized and romanticized, feasibly to the point where now it's impossible to really know what was fact and what was fiction. And when it comes to Billy the Kid, even more so. Hundreds of songs, books, motion pictures, radio programs, television movies, and even plays have been inspired by him. And a quick Google search will show that the world does not at all agree about this man's life. There are millions of points of conflicting information about the same person. He was born in Texas. He was born in New York. He was born overseas. He was a thief. He was a murderer. He was both. And he was neither. So, what's the truth? Well, lean back for the next little bit and enjoy as TSO shares this compelling alternative story of Billy the Kid. One that shows him not as the rebel child and ruthless gunslinger that history has made him out to be, and one where he's not shot and killed by Pat Garrett, but rather one where little-known evidence actually supports the idea that he just might have been assisted by the New Mexico government in a conspiracy to fake his own death. So, this report begins in New York City, New York. You know, it's crazy to me, living here in the information age, how there's still so much that we don't know. There's still quite a bit of controversy over Billy the Kid's date and place of birth. But many people believe that Billy the Kid was most likely born in Manhattan, New York on September 17, 1859 as Patrick Henry McCarty. Then just a couple of years later, his brother Joseph was born. So it's very likely that the person who would one day become the infamous Billy the Kid actually spent his childhood years as Patrick, living with a loving mother, a younger brother, and receiving a fairly good grammar school education in a world that looked nothing like the Old West. But then, in 1868, his mother met a man named William Antrim, and she and the boys moved with him to Indiana, which was a much less civilized area of the world than New York was. And as he grew older, his home life would just become more and more unstable. Just 2 years after he was uprooted from New York, right around the time that he was probably making quality childhood friends, the family moved again, this time to Wichita, Kansas. They were heading further away from society and deeper into the Old West. Compared to New York, Wichita was just a speck. It was so small, in fact, that at this time in history, it was nicknamed Cowtown. Well, the family lived in Wichita for 3 years, and then in March of 1873, his mother married William Antrim, and the family moved again, first to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then to Silver City. So now, at just 14 years old, young Patrick was squarely living in the Wild West, most likely with faded memories of a childhood nostalgia long past. Some historians say that it was right around this time that he started calling himself William H. Bonney, most likely in an attempt to make a deeper connection with the father figure in his life, William Antrim. Unfortunately, this would not be the case, as just a year and a half after his mother married Mr. Antrim on Wednesday, September 16, 1874, due to complications of tuberculosis, she died. And Mr. Antrim was not a stand-up guy. Instead of taking care of the boys, he decided that he would abandon them, and he split them up, put them into separate orphanages, and then Mr. Antrim, he left. You know, history books generally only give the cold hard facts of past events. They're really not designed to help someone understand the emotions of why something took place or why someone chose one life path over another. And no one can really say definitively exactly what motivated William H. Bonney to become the person that he did. But it's not too difficult to imagine what it must have been like for him, right? Most historians agree that he was very intelligent, and at this point in his life, as we've already seen, he had a roller coaster of experiences with a life that just became more and more unstable as he grew older. So I can't see how he couldn't have felt just completely abandoned by nearly everyone. And it was at this point in his life that the boy slowly began morphing into the legend. In 1875, he was arrested for stealing food, and his experience of being arrested wasn't a good one. You know, I've often wondered how his life might have turned out had the arresting officer, or the judge, or the courts, or anyone else in his life had taken a second look at this sharp kid who was just kind of floating on a wing and a prayer, looking for something stable to hold on to. Anyway, his experience with the system reaffirmed to him that he was the only person that he could depend on. So in late September of 1875, he made another poor decision, and he stood lookout as a friend of his named George Schaefer robbed a Chinese laundry. Unfortunately, he was caught again. This time, however, he didn't wait around for his court date, and some sources say that he actually, check this out, climbed up the jailhouse chimney to escape. Well, he fled to Arizona, and records show that in April of 1876, he met a man named John Mackey. Mackey wasn't the best of influences, and on March 25, 1877, he and Mackey were arrested for stealing horses. And incredibly, he slipped out of his shackles, and for a second time, he escaped into the desert. Then, just 5 months later, William Bonney would go from horse thief to killer. On Friday night, August 17, 1877, William, or let's just start calling him Billy from now on, joined a poker game, and he got into an argument with a blacksmith by the name of Francis Cahill. Well, the argument heated up fast, and both men exchanged some pretty strong insults. And after a moment, it became physical, with both men throwing blows. Well, a second later, Billy found himself pinned to the floor, and it was at this point that Billy changed the course of his life forever. He struggled, managed to get a hold of his gun, and then, of course, shot Cahill. Well, Cahill died the next day. Well, not wanting to stick around for another criminal charge, Billy fled Arizona, and he returned to New Mexico, and he joined a gang of outlaws called the Boys. Just 3 months after Billy the Kid shot and killed Francis Cahill in November of 1876, a wealthy young Englishman named John Tunstill arrived in Lincoln County, where he intended to develop a cattle ranch, a store, and a bank. Well, he was in partnership with two other people, a young attorney named Alexander Sweeney and the famous cattle rancher John Chisholm. Now, in the 1988 Hollywood movie Young Guns, John Tunstill was portrayed as an older man, kind of acting like a father figure for Billy. But in reality, Tunstill was only 24 years old. When John Tunstill came over from England, he had no idea at that time in history Lincoln County was dominated both economically and politically by a mafia-style organization known as the Santa Fe Ring. Pretty high up in this syndicate were a couple of corrupt, ruthless, and powerful business owners, Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan. Using their connections in the Santa Fe ring and positioning themselves just right, they had all but cornered the market on cattle ranching, and they owned the only store in the county. Being that it was the only store in the county, everyone had to go to them for supplies, which of course was putting tons of money into their pockets. So when young John Tunstill arrived, well, Murphy and Dolan just could not let him succeed, right? So they hired thugs to harass him. They hired the John Kinney gang, the Seven Rivers Warriors gang, and they also hired the gang Billy was a part of, the Boys. The goal, of course, was to make things so difficult for Tunstill that he'd have to just give up and take his business someplace else. Tunstill, however, proved to be more resilient than they had thought. And after a while, Murphy and Dolan turned up the heat, and at one point, the Boys stole some of Tunstill's horses. And later, Billy was caught with those horses, and he was arrested. Once he was released, Tunstill sought him out, and he confronted him. "Why did you steal my horses?" Well, Tunstill must have seen some kind of goodness somewhere inside of Billy, because not only did he forgive him for stealing the horses and not press charges, but to show his faith in Billy, he offered him a job. A job, get this, to protect the very horses that Billy had stolen in the first place. Well, this had a profound effect on Billy because he immediately dropped out of the gang and he took the job. Then, tragically, as I'm sure you already know, on Monday, February 18th, 1878, the man who had just forgiven Billy saw something promising in him. John Tunstill was gunned down in cold blood by the Boys, and Billy was there and helpless to do anything about it when it happened. Well, the day after the killing, Billy and another man named Richard Brewer went to see the Justice of the Peace in Lincoln County. It was a man named John Wilson. John Wilson listened to their complaint, and then he swore out warrants for the gunmen. But the gunmen were deeply tied into the Santa Fe ring, and before long, there was a full-blown war. And tons of books and movies have been made about Billy the Kid's role in the Lincoln County Wars. But here, we're not going to be getting into that. Instead, we're going to look at this crazy conspiracy where the New Mexico government actually worked with Billy the Kid to fake his own death. The Lincoln County Wars were crazy, and at one point Billy agreed that he would testify in exchange for a pardon, so he was taken into custody for his own safety. Well, in April of 1879, he appeared before a grand jury, and he testified just like he said he would. But instead of letting him go, the district attorney, who was deeply controlled by the Santa Fe ring, revoked his pardon and refused to release him. And this is where our story and the reported history part ways. History says that Billy the Kid escaped prison for the last time, became a fugitive of the law, and soon after that was shot and killed by Pat Garrett. But according to some sources, Governor Wallace, feeling like he owed Billy, secretly met with Pat Garrett and enlisted him in a covert plan to keep Billy safe. Believe it or not, there is a shred of evidence to suggest that this just might have been how it happened. It's a little technical, but I think it's important to share. See, Pat Garrett really did not have the authority to track Billy out of Lincoln County. That was out of his jurisdiction. But the history books say that because of a clerical error, Garrett obtained the authority by gaining the title of U.S. Marshal, and then this title allowed him to track Billy across the country. But this title was invalid. On November 2nd, 1880, Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, and around the same time, 2 U.S. Marshal commissions came in through the wire. Ironically, both were for the same man, a man named Johnny Hurley. Now, of course, Hurley could not possibly act as 2 U.S. Marshals, so Hurley's name was scratched out of one of the commissions, and Pat Garrett's was filled in. History, of course, says that this was an accident. Proponents of this conspiracy, however, say that this is no accident, and something like this could have only been orchestrated at the highest levels of the government. The theory, of course, is that Pat Garrett was ordered to meet up with Billy at Fort Sumner and fake his death, thereby removing him from the Santa Fe ring's hit list. Now, this conspiracy is rather thin, I admit that, and at first I didn't know what to believe. But then I met a man who claims that he was related to Billy the Kid.
My name is John Martinez. I live in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. I've lived here all my life. I was born on an Indian reservation in northern New Mexico, and I have Apache ancestry on my mother's side. My great-grandfather's name was Pakwa Anaya. My grandmother's name was Ophelia Anaya. She had a child by Billy the Kid before she married my grandfather. That's my connection. When Billy the Kid was killed, I believe it wasn't him. We believe it wasn't him. The books, everybody else believes it was. No, one of the things I have to remember is this cousin of mine who wrote a book. It's called The Spanish Connection. He believes that Billy was killed. I don't believe it because my great-grandfather, Pakwa Anaya, whose daughter, my grandmother, had a kid by Billy the Kid, my Uncle Pat. My Uncle Pat, incidentally, was baptized by Pat Garrett. My grandfather married her when Billy, my Uncle Pat, Billy's boy, was 2 years old. They used to dress him as a girl. He had long hair and he had curls, and they were afraid that if they didn't dress him like a girl, if people would know that he was the son of Billy the Kid, they would kill him. So here goes. The night that Billy was killed, he had a friend that was from Texas. His name was also Bob. He said they called him Little Billy because he used to imitate Billy. The Hispanics used to call him El Pope, which meant a puppy dog. He would follow Billy around. He would imitate him. He tried to dress for him. His mannerisms, the way he walked, everything. The night that Billy the Kid was killed, the history says he was shot by Pat Garrett. He didn't shoot him with a pistol. He shot him with a shotgun in the face. He was hard to identify. The night that he killed him, they brought him out. They impaneled a coroner's jury, which was made up all of Billy's friends, his cuates, what he called his compas, his compadres. The leader of the coroner's jury was my great-grandfather, Pakwa Anaya. He was also a justice of the peace. They brought him out. They put him on a bench, and he was buried by 8:30 next morning without anybody else seeing the body. The body could not be identified because the face was shot up. The next morning, Billy the Kid's horse, a horse that he treasured very dearly, that was given to him by Tunstill, Billy's tack, Billy's saddle, Billy's horse was missing from the corral behind the house, Maxwell house. The horse that belonged to this other Billy that come from Texas, his horse was still there and nobody ever claimed him. Now, that's a connection. Later on in years, I happened to become acquainted with a fellow by the name of Daniel Sherlock. This was a great-grandson to Doc Sherlock, who was a member of the Regulators. Okay. Then Daniel told me that his grandfather, who was the son of Doc Sherlock, had told him they killed the wrong Billy. And he told him some things about what happened, that he and Pat Garrett were compas. They were really close buddies. They used to ride together. They used to steal cattle together and incidentally sell them to my grandpa, who was a butcher in Fort Sumner, besides being justice of the peace. Then after that was all done and buried, Sherlock told me that Billy, my grandfather, Doc Sherlock's son, told me that Billy was blamed for a hell of a lot more killings than he did. He really didn't do that many killings. My grandfather, on my father's side, was a lawman. His name was Hilario. Incidentally, my grandfather, who used to be a regulator, Billy's friend, was also named Hilario, but he changed his name. He was born Virginio Salazar Garcia. When he got wounded real bad, he went back to the place he was born, which was White Oaks, and he was nursed back to health by his aunt. He decided he'd better get out of Lincoln because he was wanted. He moved to Fort Sumner. That's where he met my grandfather. He changed his name from Virginio, which they call him Genio Salazar Garcia, to the name of his godfather, Hilario, and he dropped the Salazar and he dropped the Virginio. He became Hilario Garcia. That was my grandfather that married, incidentally. Okay. Then it all happened so quickly that nobody ever gave anything. Later on in years, I ran into a fellow by the name of Leonardo Gonzalez, an old man. He told me that he had delivered some rams to a rancher in El Paso once, and they had gone across into Juarez, and they were at a bar having a drink when this blue-eyed, blonde-haired young fellow drove up to him, and he asked him, "Tú te llamas Leonardo?" Sí. "¿Sabes quién soy yo?" Which means, "You know who I am?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Callao," mean quiet. He told him, "Bueno," but he told him, "I am married, I live in Cañutillo, I have a family, I'm very happy. But don't go, how are my compas?" His meaning his friends. He told him, "They're all dead except one that I know of." He said, and that would be Hilario, Gino, and one other one, Jose Chavez y Chavez. Now, I own the saddle that belonged to Jose Chavez and Chavez. Jose Chavez and Chavez died in Milagro as an old man when he got out of prison. My great-grandfather hired him to sweep a warehouse that he had in Pastura, New Mexico. He had rheumatism very bad. He married a lady by the name of Sandoval from Milagro, New Mexico. She gave me his saddle. I have it in my possession. I also have other things that belong to Chavez and Chavez. I have some things that belong to Billy the Kid also, supposedly. I have pictures that were taken during the marriage of Pat Garrett to a lady from Antonchico, New Mexico, a picture of him, Pat Garrett, with his father-in-law, and then a picture of the lady's father-in-law with what we think is Billy the Kid. We cannot authenticate it. We don't have the money. I wish we could. Doc Sherlock told me so many stories about his grandpa that we were putting them together, and I'm really of the belief that this fellow from Hico, Texas, by the name of Bushy Bill Roberts, was really Billy the Kid, because he met with other old-timers when he came to New Mexico to visit the governor, try to get a pardon from the governor before he died. And incidentally, Governor Cargo would not give him a pardon, and Mr. Hico died just a very few days later back in Hico, and not Mr. Hico, died back in Hico, Texas, Bushy Bill Roberts. There was a fellow by the name of Silva that was an old man who used to ride with Billy the Kid, who had met Bushy Bill Roberts, and they compared scars and places, and he really swore that Billy the Kid was still alive. Now, my great-grandfather wrote a book in Spanish called "I Buried Billy." It was translated by a fellow by the name of Joe Bolin, who owned a big jewelry store in Fort Sumner, and the book is still up for sale. You can buy it anywhere you want. The best place would be at the Billy Kid Museum that is run in Fort Sumner. In the book, which was translated from Spanish to English, it said, "Enterramos un Billy que no era Billy." And in the translation says, "We buried a Billy." He didn't say we buried the Billy or we buried Billy the Kid. He said, "We buried the Billy." Now, my grandfather claimed in his later years that it was all a setup, that Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett were not only good friends, but they were compadres, which tied them in Spanish culture to be just like brothers. I think somebody that knows how to write should really get together and do a little bit more research into maybe a little DNA testing into the bench where this fellow was there's still some blood on it that was laid out that was supposedly Billy the Kid, but Billy never died.
So, this one's crazy, isn't it? There's a lot to this story, and even after the interview, I still don't know how much of it I believe. Did the New Mexico government actually conspire to fake the death of Billy the Kid? That sounds outlandish, right? Still, there are breadcrumbs that seem to suggest that it's possible. In the last segment, John Martinez spoke of a man named Brushy Bill Roberts. What do we know about him? Well, in 1948, a lawyer named William Vincent Morrison was appointed to settle a court dispute for a man named Joe Hines. Joe Hines was trying to prove his identity so that he could lay claim to his brother's land, who had recently died. Hines claimed that he was, now get this, the outlaw Jesse Evans. That's the leader of the gang called the Boys, and he talked in depth about the Lincoln County Wars. And he knew things that seemingly only someone who would have been involved in those wars would have known. Now, this is where things begin to get interesting, because at one point in their conversations, he claimed that Billy the Kid wasn't dead. He told Morrison that Pat Garrett did not kill Billy the Kid, and in fact, Billy the Kid was still living. Well, skeptical, Morrison started digging, and eventually he came to a man named William H. Brushy Bill Roberts in Hiko, Texas.
After being discovered by Morrison in 1948, William Henry Roberts wasn't able to keep his secret. He had the look, the size, the features, and the scars. In addition, and perhaps more important, he knew too much. At the time of his discovery and during subsequent interviews, Roberts manifested an impressive and intimate knowledge of New Mexico's Lincoln County War and its associated personalities and politics during the 1870s and 1880s, a knowledge that exceeded that of the historians of the day. Confronted with substantial evidence by Morrison, Roberts broke down. In tears, he admitted he'd been running and hiding from the law for most of his life and confessed his true identity. The outlaw Billy the Kid. Noted historian, folklorist, and writer C.L. Sonicson described Roberts as a Western Lazarus, risen from the dead with a 6-shooter in each hand, who was willing to tell of his experiences behind the veil.
There's a lot of skepticism surrounding this man, Brushy Bill Roberts, and there's evidence that says that he was either just delusional or a flat-out liar, but he most certainly was not Billy the Kid. A woman named Geneva Pittman came forward, and she said that she was Brushy's niece, and she knew for a fact that he was not Billy the Kid. He wasn't a gunslinger from the Old West, and she had evidence to prove it. Among this evidence was their family Bible, which listed Brushy's birth date as being in August of 1879. That means that he would have only been 2 years old when he was supposedly shot and killed by Pat Garrett. The conspiracy theorists, on the other hand, say, well, it's not rocket science, right? Records were intentionally fabricated to create a new life for Billy to protect him. Well, all of this really bothered the lawyer Morrison. He had interviewed Brushy Bill for over a year, and he had been convinced that this was indeed Billy the Kid. So after Brushy died, he arranged to see the corpse. And check this out. It had the kind of scars that one would expect to find on Billy the Kid, with 26 bullet and knife wounds. That kind of puts a damper on Miss Pittman's claim that her uncle was no gunslinger from the Old West, doesn't it? Filled with this new evidence, Morrison then tracked down his former client, Jesse Evans, and he located him with a group of other men in Round Rock, Texas. Jesse Evans and these other men all swore that they knew Billy the Kid, and they swore that Brushy Bill had indeed been Billy the Kid. And putting their money where their mouth was, they all signed affidavits. Through the years, evidence that he was and evidence that he was not Billy the Kid just keeps coming in. But one piece of evidence seems to have been significant. In 1990, a study using photo comparison technology was done at the Laboratory for Vision Studies and Advanced Graphics at the University of Texas. The study used the same software that had been used by the FBI, the CIA, and Interpol for years, and it was well known for providing a very high level of accuracy. Well, photographs of Brushy Bill Roberts and the one photograph the world has of Billy the Kid were put into the software and compared. And even though he was 60 years older when he died, the program gave a whopping 93% possibility that Brushy Bill Roberts was indeed Billy the Kid. In 1996, the results of this study were presented to the courts, and it was found that, based on the study and some other evidence, the case for Roberts being Billy the Kid was strong, substantial, and excellent. So, what do you think? Was Billy the Kid shot down by Pat Garrett? And if not, was Governor Wallace in on some cover-up to fake his death? Was Brushy significantly ruled out as not being Billy the Kid? Or do you think that there's actually a chance that maybe he was Billy the Kid? Now, as I said last week, if you'd like to keep the party going, then hop on over to our other channel, Vel Arcana. We just dropped a new mystery there a few minutes ago. Thank you.